future. Gentlemen, may I say, Prof, welcome, and Prof is Papa. So when I say Papa, everybody will say, yeah, yeah. Papa, memo akwaba. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I guess Mr. Kweku Dako Ankra is also online, and so we will be speaking with him as well. Good morning, Uncle Kweku Dako Ankra.
Okay, thank you. Good morning.
How are you today?
I'm fine.
So what should I say? Ojeku, is that correct?
Yeah, Ojema.
Ojema, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Let me start with you before I go to Papa. Now, you are a historian, and we're talking about Ghana's Republican status. Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast. It's existed for quite some centuries and all that. But the struggle for independence, came into reality. And I think that Professor Gabriel Ishen mentioned some names earlier, Jacob Wilson Say, and a few more others, Park Grant and Co. haven't fought, for this whole campaign. But it was not until 1957 that independence was actually won. But we still were under some form of colonial direction and all that. So it was not until the 1st of July 1960 that what we would refer to as the Republican status actually hit us. Do you want to just take us through a little bit of a historical walkthrough to how the Republican status came into being?
Okay, thank you very much. So after this, the independence, gotten as the political independence, and then after that independence, we still have the governor general still around, and so it was though we had independence, but in terms of total control of a new country, we didn't have it. So Nkrumah was still a prime minister, and we never had president because we were still operating the Westminster system. And so after 1957, there was the need for us to experiment further to have the kind of constitution that will be solely Ghana-made constitution. That is constitution made by the newly independent people themselves without any foreign intervention, as opposed to the 1957 constitution, which was a sort of a constitution drafted in the United Kingdom that was brought down to Ghana, and then we all participated in it. And then we had the constitution of the 1957 towards the independence. But for 1960, it was going to be solely African-made or Ghanaian-made constitution, which will have the aspirations and all the features and visions that we want to have as people to rule ourselves free from all the strictures of colonialism, and then we become total independent. So that is how we became a republic. So as a republic, Ghana has a total independence without having its April string tied to the British again. So from that time on, we never had any governor general who was in as a representative of the Queen to the Gold Coast or to Ghana. So we were wholly new people with our own destiny in our own hand. That is how different it is. So the Republican status gives us a total freedom. It gives us a total emancipation economically, politically, socially, and in fact, free forever.
Free forever is what Mr. Kweku Dako Ankra says. And he talked about the independence struggle, which came to finality in 1957. And yet, we only had a prime minister. We still had the governor general lurking around and still controlling some of the activities and decisions and visions of the people and all that. And it was not until 3 years later. Chief Dako Ankra, before I go to Prof, would you say that the Republican status over the last 60 years, 66 years, I should say, has brought the dreams of the forebears together?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent we have failed, and to some extent we have also made chalk certain advantages.
If I'll put
As
it to
you
you,
know,
if I'll put it to you, we failed in certain circumstances and we chalked some successes in certain circumstances. Let me just put it to you. What percentage would you put to the two?
it is difficult because, as you know, our independence, after independence, our journey towards democratization has not been smooth. It has been checkered. We have had a series of coup d'etats that actually truncated our desire to have these aspirations achieved. So, for me, I would not be wise to say we should give some sort of quota, but to a large extent, we could have done far better than what we have done so far. Because I can assure you that if you look at the caliber of educated people who have produced over the years, engineers, lawyers, medical doctors, people who have achieved world class record in wherever they found themselves, and how this country have come so far, I would say that we have not done well. We could have done far better than what we have done today.
You will at the stage hold your guns and will be reminded by the headmaster for the morning, Nana Safokantanka, that come the end of the study period, which will be about 5 minutes to 10, you'll be brought back to the classroom to answer the same question that you are seeking to look for a loophole to dodge the question. You'll be brought back to the table, and I'll be standing right by you and supervising your answer to the question. But for now, you may want to reflect. Prof, I'll come back to you, and I should say that I will not at all be qualified to put any questions whatsoever, because if anything at all, I should be sitting on the table and you supervising the answer to the question that I posed to myself. But in continuing, Prof, you are a governance expert, and these two historical annals in Ghana's history, independence and republic, today actually is that of the Republican status. Can you give us a brief review of what these significant days should have done to the governance of the Republic of Ghana?
Thank you, and again, thanks for having me. And I think if I should pick from where my good friend Mr. Ankra just spoke about the history, certainly republicanism, well, whilst we got our independence in 57, 1963 years later, we attained our republic status. The main difference between getting independence and becoming a republic, I think, can be traced to the origins of republicanism. If you recall the French Revolution, where the first overthrow of the European monarch occurred, and then followed later by the American Revolution. It was the American Revolution and their independence that really brought into sharp focus the meaning of a republic. You know, the Americans did not want to have any traces at all to the governance structure and systems of their former colonizers, that is the British. So they discarded completely all ties with that kind of governance. Republic, when you declare yourself republic, meaning you become a sovereign nation, which also means that the ultimate power of that territory, that state, belongs to the people. That's why we say sovereignty is in the hands of the people. And what does that mean? We can again get a better meaning if we recall the famous dictum or description of democracy by Abraham Lincoln, who said it's a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. In other words, the people become the center of governance. And that is a very interesting, very deep, very provocative thought. How do you make the people become the center of governance? That has been the challenge that nations have faced since then. But let me try to simplify. When we say it's a government of the people, by the people, for the people, then it requires the governance of the country to be fully owned by the people themselves. In other words, it disavows a dictatorship, authoritarianism, and all the other forms of governments that appear oppressive. In other words, the people have the freedom to not only to participate, but also to determine who rules them. So if we come to Ghana, the question becomes, how far has our governance been one of the people, for the people, and by the people? You know, when we started with Kwame Nkrumah, for all the excellent things, great things that he accomplished, for which we still remember him very fondly, we also know that somehow in the line, it was no longer a government by and for and of the people. When you make these statements, some people misunderstand it and think you are bashing Nkrumah. That is not the point. The fact is that where people cease to be the owners of the state, and the state becomes controlled and dominated by one personality, then that Lincolnian philosophy or description of democracy vanishes. Okay? Now, since then, we have gone through all kinds of governance, especially the military rule and interregnums, and then we come back to civilian rule up to the Fourth Republic that we enjoy today, and hopefully this will be the last. So now look at the Fourth Republic and how we have structured governance, and ask yourself, to what extent are the people made to be of government? How, to what extent have government of this country been for the people and by the people? In many ways, we have structures that reflect that. But in my humble opinion, these have been hollow structures, because as we speak, the Fourth Republican Constitution puts so much power in the hands of the executive. Look, currently, this flood that deluged Accra, the president is giving directives. We are releasing 300 million. I'm directing the MDAs to do A, B, C, D. It's what you call a top-heavy governance structure. The MDCs and the district assemblies should have been empowered enough to deal with this, and failing or lacking the capacity, then the central government will come in and support it. That's where you see people actually taking command of their lives, but not always being directed from the top to do the mundane things that people do. So this is just to give you a glimpse of the challenge that I'm exposing today.
I love the glimpse of the challenge. And I think that is the essence of what Z Multimedia, and for that matter, the whole of the Republic of Ghana, seeks to espouse. Before I go back to Mr. Dakun Ankra, Prof, you'll just indulge me just a little while. You seem to have diagnosed what the whole system of governance is expected to be. And you talked about what independence actually entailed, and from which we moved forward as a notch higher, and then metamorphosed into full self-governance, and that's where you talked about sovereignty. Now, traveling from that era, the first, through some of the military interventions, and then to the second military intervention, the third military intervention, and now the Fourth Republic. Now, if you look at the scope of what the Lincolnian definition of what democracy or governance is supposed to be, and I take this from you this morning, if it is a governance of the people, for the people, and by the people, won't you say that what we have experienced over the period up to this Fourth Republic, and I recall very well, I did not see the Third Republican Constitution, even though I have studied it, the Fourth Republic actually was more involving of the ordinary people. And yet, it is the same constitution that you seem to critique and say that it seems to have put a little more power into the hands of the executive. Did it not emanate from the people?
Excellent question. Excellent question. It did emanate from the people, but in a different way. The Constitution, we know how this Constitution was written and how it was ratified by the People's Assembly. But if you are a real historian, you go deep into how it came about, then you understand. If you talk to people who are members of this constitutional body, the constitutional drafting body, I think you get some very interesting insights. That is not to delimit the extent to which the then regime PNDC went to ensure that these constitutions come to be. But at the same time, we also know it's not written anywhere, but just talk to those who are part of the constitutional drafting body, the People's Assembly, whatever it was called, and you also understand why certain clauses, why certain provisions were put in there. And that, for me, is a very interesting kind of stuff. Maybe it was done to make sure that the transition becomes smooth, because at that time, people were not even certain that the leader of the time, Jerry Rawlings, will even allow that transition to take place. So there was what I may call appeasement or compromise, if you will, by certain powerful individuals, just to ensure that we go. But that's okay. I think they were smart. They were guided by wisdom in doing that. But going beyond that, we realized that there are certain challenges that seem to be delimiting the ability of people to become the real sovereign. You see, going back to the definition I gave earlier, the real sovereignty. And it could have been simple. Look at the American system. Of course, it's not perfect. And in fact, the past few years have even indicated that America may not be a model for us, because democracy requires every society to engineer its governance according to its own unique history, culture, and traditions. That's what democracy. So we don't have to imitate what the Americans do or what the British do, because there's nothing like a perfect democracy. Now, having said that, if the people should be the way the Americans approached it, is the federal structure, where beyond or below the federal government, we have state governments, and below the state governments, we have all kinds of governance structures, counties, districts, you name them. And at every level, people have power to make certain local decisions. They have the power to mobilize local resources. All these things are done. If you take the theory of decentralization, you begin to see how this is done. You decentralize. It doesn't mean if you decentralize, the central government, that is the national government, is divorced from what you do. No, because the central government will continue to monopolize resources. It takes taxes and all, and therefore is obliged to come down to those levels to provide cushions, support, and all kinds of things. But not to the extent where, when there's a flood in the district, directives come from the president. It should come from the local people themselves. What the system has done is to make all of us lazy. We're talking about citizenship, but we don't act it, because everybody expects government, as if it's the law, to come down to our aid when we're in difficulty. So people have lost this kind of self-help. And we can go through Ghana history and know the periods where self-help was a major national agenda. That if you want local schools, there must be self-help. So we have self-help projects, where projects are initiated by people themselves. Look at sanitation. Today's central government controls sanitation all over the country. How is that possible? So we spend millions of cedis, pay some private person from Accra to take charge of sanitation. What is the role of citizens? So these are the kinds of things we need to look at closely and begin to examine them and see where the problems are. I'm saying in short that we have made the central government such a supreme body that without it, local people are powerless. That's why at times a president will go to a village for a function and the village chief will stand up and say, Mr. President, my people don't have anywhere to leave their legs. That is figuratively speaking. But in a more mundane way, we don't have toilets. So, Mr. President, we need toilets. President do not provide toilets. Toilets should be the responsibility of the local people themselves. But because we have created the impression that the government provides everything for us, we always look up. We don't look down. We don't look at where we are. So basically, I'm trying to suggest to you that the government of the people, for the people, and by the people, we are missing that understanding of how our democratic governance have been structured.
I'm not too sure if I brought back that understanding. It will be fair to describe it as power to the people. We'll come back, Professor Bafo Ajimendia, to examine further how the devolution concept, the decentralization concept, which most of the time would go with the devolution of power. We'll come back to examine how far that has impacted us, and in going forward, what we should do. For now, me, Dako Ankra, the historian, listening through to what the good professor has espoused this morning, I'm beginning to ask myself, Ghana, and for that matter, Gold Coast, the leadership at the time, the chiefs, the opinion leaders, had studied what the colonial masters had done over centuries, if not decades, before we finally got into the 1950s, where the struggle became a little, increased in terms of the fight for the independence and all that. In 1957, we finally got it. It did not stop there. We continued to struggle. A luta continua is what recently it had been described. Then in 1960, sovereignty actually came and resided, supposedly, in the people. What did we learn? And what did we not learn that is bringing us to this point? The good historian, sir.
Okay, so first, Prof has really laid a very solid foundation for me to carry on.
Carry on, sir. Carry on, sir.
If you look at after our independence, there's a work by two scholars that I really appreciate, Peter Eke, where he talked about the two publics, as well as the work of Mahmoud Mandani, Citizens and Subjects. If you look at the conceptual frameworks of these works and you apply it to our very existence, you realize that as a country, when we had our independence, that political structure where the colonial authorities actually ruled with a centralized power, and they did not allow the power to actually move to the peripheries for people to have a feel which is the devolution of the power itself to the people, for people to become participants in their own governance system. And we see it even in the colonial days when there was an attempt to create town councils before the legislative councils, and the role of the governor in how he applied the rules. So the governor became so powerful in terms of allocations of resources to the various provinces, the districts, and so on. We realized that after the independence, that colonial structure did not actually change. The Africans actually took over that colonial political structures that give power to the colonial authorities. The Africans just pushed the whites away and then occupied that modern political system.
Was that part of what we learned?
Yes, that is what we used. We did not actually try to let it dissipate and then reach the people within the periphery. That is trying to get people to be involved in the governance system. So the Africans just took the European political power structure that was left, including the economic structure.
My uncle used to say, sorry, don't lose your thoughts here.
Okay.
Akwasi bruni ko na akwasi bibini waba. Kwasi ko enso da so jina nkwantia.
Absolutely. So when it comes to even the application of law, there is a law that goes for people who are educated, and there is a law that is for people who are uneducated. So we see that right from the independence, the idea of the intelligentsia, the new elites, the political authorities, then became the actual citizens of the nation when the distribution of the public goods was allocated to them, as opposed to the ordinary people who didn't have opportunity and have to still go through the primordial structures to get the opportunities. And so therefore they remain as subject as it is in the colonial era. And we didn't do things right to ensure that the decentralization effort will give more power to the people. Let me give you a typical example with specific reference to even the Accra Flooding. Back in the 1870s, when there was an attempt in 1860s for the formation of the Legislative Council, which you have this Bannerman then being elected to join the governor's Legislative Council, later on devolving through Kuntu Blankson and Samuel Collins Bruce and so on. What happened was that the Africans themselves wanted to be involved in the governance of the Gold Coast. And as a result, they actually come up for town councils where they will meet and then also have their own power to develop within their communities. And by so doing, if you look at the post-tax ordinances, they were asking for allocation of the centralized money that the governor actually takes to be allocated to them within the district for the development. So in Cape Coast, for example, they were arguing for how when it rains in the Cape Coast, most of the water will come and drain at the Kosu Lagoon near St. Augustine, and it generates a lot of mosquitoes back in the day. And the governor was always using the money not for those specific projects. So they actually clamored for the distribution of the resources to that community for the project. The government didn't listen. Later on, when the committee of the colonial authority sat in Accra, in London, Lord Cameron was arguing that Cape Coast is now not even a better place for a capital to be sited, and Accra has the better geographical position for a new capital to be sited. So arguments went in because of the inability of giving powers to the people within Cape Coast. They were not able to even argue for resources to deal with some of the environmental situation that was happening there. And we see that same situation today in Accra, where powers have not been given to district assemblies, who would have opportunity of knowing every locale and what is happening in terms of the water system, where there is a waterway for these people to have their own bylaws to ensure that certain structures will not be put in certain areas, we try to mix everything up with politics. And so what a central authority, that is the governance structure, will say is what people will listen. So you see that individuals are not allowed within the locality to have a say within their own government. And this has affected us to this day.
If I may quickly interject, Nida Kon Ankra, are you saying that the present district, municipal, and metropolitan assemblies do not have the requisite bylaws to be able to enforce some of these developmental issues that you're talking about?
So as it is, on paper, you see that we have had this beautiful idea of having bylaws and so on. But if you look at the district assembly concept itself, it is only within the district assembly that you will even have the president representatives in the villages that the president even do not know them. They call them the president's appointees or the government appointees. And all these people are taking powers not from the people within the locality, but from the central authority. And they all add up in trying to superimpose the will of the government over the local issues. And so do not think that we have bylaws within the locality. For instance, if somebody goes to build a house on the waterway in Weja, Bawi areas, where we have the waterway system, and then the person is using governmental authority, he's a minister of state, he's a big-time member of a political party, and he wants to put a burden there, the district assembly cannot do anything about it because the overwhelming power of the executive. This is what we are talking about. So the role of the district assembly is ensuring that they have their way in bringing better development, bringing very good policies that will deal with their everyday situation. They are not able to actually enforce it because there is a central authority or an executive power which they have to always bend to.
Z 101.9 FM.
Well, your dial is on 101.9 FM. It is Z, and the platform is the Business Breakfast on Z. This is where nationhood, nationalism, civic responsibility, but above all, lifestyle, leisure, and business platforms exist. And this morning, we have been looking at the issue of the Republic Day reflections. Lessons from history, looking into the future, and of course, the visitor we have, the floods. It has never been a visitor. We are told historically that these floods have come decades even before independence. But 66 years after the Republican status, they still live with us. Where is the power? And now we are even being told that apart from the power, which sometimes exists on paper, there is a way that the resources themselves are controlled from somewhere. If you want to join this conversation, you can come to us via WhatsApp 0544 321 019. 0544 321 1019, I beg your pardon. And on landline, you can reach us via 030 395 6641. If you are on social media, we are live on Instagram, on Facebook, and on X. I'm told that it may not necessarily be live, but you can reach us on Instagram, Facebook, and X via ZFMGH. And if you're on TikTok, on YouTube, where we are live, you can reach us via Z Multimedia. And don't forget our website, www.zmultimedia.com. Republic Day Reflections. Lessons, historical, and peeping into the future. The floods that have come to visit us today Doing justice to the topic, we have Professor Bafo Ajimenduya, a very well-known governance expert, and the historian Opeyin Kweku Dakon Ankra. Justice is being done. Join us and let's make sure that we build together. I take a quick peek back to you, Prof. Papa Bafo Ajimenduya. You started with the concept of decentralization. It looks like the devolution bit probably makes it a better twin. But from the historical account that we are getting this morning, you probably have a government for the people, of the people, by the people. But as to whether they're really in control is another matter. What do you say to this dichotomy, this irony, this situation where we probably seem to be in control of our affairs, but in reality are not necessarily? When we come back later, we'll look at what things to do in moving forward. But for now, let's look at that dichotomy between what is expected to be and what really is. Prof.
Very interesting question, because as you were asking the question, I was reminded quickly. I recall the one credited with the credited with the founder of decentralization, so to speak, in the country. In the 80s, in the 90s, towards the Constitution, Mr. Kwame Nkrumah, Professor Kwame Nkrumah was quite a powerful person in government, and apparently he engineered the kind of decentralization we have. And not long ago, maybe about 3 or so weeks ago, on the news, we heard that he made the intra-ministerial something meeting where he laid out his concept of decentralization, a concept that he has held since the 80s to today. And this time he was more specific as to why we don't have the devolution of power that you refer to. And I think also his concept gives answer to your point why this dichotomy, this illusion that we have decentralized but power is still retained. So this is not me, it's Kwame Nkrumah. You remember what he said? Not long ago, he said that decentralization cannot be allowed to go its full hog, because if we are not lucky to have a good Asantehene, like a rogue becomes Asantehene, he will give government. If they resist, they can undermine the country. You remember this, Mr. My good friend Nanaji?
Yes, Papa.
Very good. You see, when people make statements, you've got to take them seriously, because this is the originator of the current decentralization that we have, and continues to wield influence over decentralization because his government is in power. And he said this not long ago. What that means, and before even I tell you what that means, I then recall back in 1995, I was a professor, Fulbright, at the University of Ghana. And there was a workshop where he attended, but he was not more specific, mentioning the Dagomba Kingdom, the Asante Kingdom, how they can give problems. He rather said, if you allow decentralization to take its natural course, there are certain areas in this country that are better endowed than others. And therefore, those areas will become more powerful and even challenge government. And therefore, we cannot allow full devolution of power. You see? So there's a certain mindset in government, especially this government.
But Prof, if I may ask, is that not a reality?
No. You ask yourself, since independence, where in this country has been any attempt, public pronouncements about seceding or causing problem for government?
Not necessarily that part, but the part about the specific geographical areas that apparently have more resources than the others, and for that
I
matter,
like that.
there will be the need for a certain level of moderation, just so that there will be some level of equity in the system.
I like your point. It's a typical thinking of so-called socialists in the 60s and 70s that there should be equal development and equal everything. It doesn't exist anywhere in the
But
world.
Prof, you know that equality and equity does not necessarily mean the same thing.
Yeah, of course not. But you see, that is the art of governance. A government will have policies that will regulate the use, exploitation of these resources, that will extract more from those who have and less from those who don't. And then use that power to circulate wealth to ensure that everything benefits from the wealth of the nation. Do you understand me?
I do, but is
In
that
other
not
words,
what exactly, is that not necessarily the kind of concept that is being espoused here?
wait a minute. We are not allowing individuals or regions or areas with wealth to exploit the wealth because of the fear that if you control the wealth in your area, then you are in a position to challenge the central government. I'm telling you that the art of governance is exactly to combat that. And that's why even in the United States, you are allowed to exist, but the central government will find a way through taxation and other extractive policies to equalize. Why do we have welfare system? Those who don't have the money that we used to pay welfare in the US, for instance, that money comes from the rich. So if you are rich, you pay more. So if you say that you have an area, you are richly endowed, and therefore you are allowed to kind of govern it, you are going to be more powerful. That means you don't know governance. And because of that, you prefer for all of us to be poor rather than for some of us to be rich.
Obviously, that is a subject that we would have to interrogate sooner than later. But bringing us back forward to where we sit and where we stand. You see, when you are with your papa, you know, you always have to find ways of managing things so that we can all float to the appropriate destination that we go. But coming back, Prof, 66 years of Republican status and 69 years of independence. Rain comes in. It is an act of nature. And indeed, we have had floods in some of the first world countries and all that. But in our case, it looks like it goes beyond the impact, the direct and full and real impact of acts of nature like heavy rains, which were recorded in the last few days or in the last 1 month, which have never been recorded in the history of this country. But it looks like beyond just this act of nature, there is something that as a people in our governance systems and structures that may not have really been turned in the right direction. What would you say is what is actually lacking and what may have actually led to the situation that we find ourselves in, Prof?
I like the way you put the question because some people may play politics with this tragedy, suggesting that perhaps it's the ineptitude of the current government. It's not. And I'm glad you said earlier that this problem of flooding in Accra have been occurring for decades. In fact, there's a recent Daily Graphic front page news article of April 1960 that tells us that there was serious floods at the time and the government of the day made some promises to deal with it. And since then, we've been dealing with it every year. So it's not a Mahama's problem or NDP's. It's a national problem. That's important to establish. Two, As my good friend on the other line, Mr. Ankra said, he made references to very important points about town councils, how it used to run in those days, and how come we have abandoned all that and created structures, district assemblies, that are toothless to do anything on their own. That, I think, is part of it. In other words, not allowing local communities to take charge of their affairs in their community. And of course, President Mahama referred to that also in his comments a few days ago, referring to the nature of Ghanaians, sanitation, and how we handle our garbage. All these things together. So it's not just that, like you said, many countries are suffering from floods this particular season, and that relates to the global issue of climate change. We know all that. But how we live our lives, our lifestyle as Ghanaians, they have contributed tremendously to this particular tragedy that we are discussing. So for me, my interest being in governance, I'll come back to governance. How do we make people become responsible citizens? That's my concern. People should be, Ghana citizenship is misunderstood. You see, citizenship is misunderstood. And I think if you take participation in politics, which is one of the key requirements, everybody thinks of what? Elections. Every 4 years we participate in electing people, but within the 4-year periods, we are not getting people engaged in their own development. You see, so I think, in addition to all the problems we have, some by nature, many of them just by our character, our habits and all, and also by the way we have structured governance to really, let me bring in quickly the issue of chieftaincy, for instance. We know in the good old days how chiefs were able to easily mobilize their people for development, not only for war fighting, but for the welfare, the well-being of people in that catchment area. Now we created this decentralization structures and did not even include the chiefs, just that they can be members of district assemblies. Well, I don't have any nostalgia for traditional rule and all that. That's not the point. But there are certain key elements in our traditions, our culture, that must be respected and elevated to fit the so-called modern structure of governance. Because if you did that, then we are bringing people more into the governance structure, and people may not be henceforth looking solely to the central government for every solution that are just local. Any problem that are local, for whose solution can be also local. Excellent. I think that is where I stand on these matters.
Excellent.
So, thank you.
Well, I think that definitely, this conversation would have to be continued sooner than later. And I think that restructuring what the citizens' representation in their governance could not have been stated in a better way. The good old professor actually puts it very, very succinctly. So we have less than 2 minutes to go. Mr. Kweku Dako Ankra, the historian, what are some of the very key lessons that we got from the historical era that should guide us in how we move forward into the future, with specific reference to what we are confronted with today, the floods and Ghana tomorrow?
Yeah, so I believe, as Prof said, more power ought to be given to the people, particularly within their own locales, so that they can make decisions that are in tune with their own life and their everyday businesses, so that what central government often do sometimes does not reflect what the people actually aspire to actually achieve within their community. And for me, again to the issue of the rains in Accra, because this is what we are facing now in a short form. You realize that the first place they develop is, for instance, Adabraka. Adabraka is the first place that it is well planned and designed. So if you go to Adabraka, you realize that after 1, 2, 3 buildings, there's a road, and then there's an alley. There is also gutters that drain straight to the Odo River. How come today we are having flood at Adabraka? It shows you that the existing plan that we had, changes have been made. People have built more than what was done there at Adabraka. So now, water cannot have access straight to the Odo River. This shows the kind of indiscipline that government after government sits down for people to use their own power to do wrong things that comes to affect the people. So there is also the need of the government ensuring that right things are done. When people build on waterways or people are building on bad places, we should be able to actually have the capacity to put down those structures. This is what we have not been able to do.
And obviously,
and we continue to worry ourselves.
And
so
obviously,
let the government also tackle the bull by the horn, so that we don't experience some of these things in the capital cities.
A clarion call coming from Mr. Kweku Dakon Ankra. How come that Adabraka, which was originally well planned, today seems to sit in an unplanned manner? Professor Bafo Ajimendria says that his main concern is about restructuring the citizenry, their voice, and their participation in governance. Because at the end of the day, democracy is government of the people, government for the people, and government by the people. That is how we wrap up on this morning's Business Breakfast on Z. Thank you so much, Professor Bafo Ajimendria, governance expert. And thank you so much, Mr. Kweku Dakon Ankra. Ghana is for us. Time to reset. Time to restructure. Shall we all be involved? And much more importantly, do the right thing. Continue sends us away this Wednesday morning, the 1st of July, 2026, in the year of our Lord. Enjoy the Republican status. 66 years. Where do we go? He says, Krohin Kro. Bye for now. Nanasafo Katanka. Until tomorrow morning, we will be right back here on your dial. Next is The Brighter Side by Jeremy Okorie Amwako.